Keynote, which I'm very excited to hear. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Eric Hekler, who is Director of the Center for Wireless and Population Health Systems at the University of California, San Diego. Dr. Hekler is an internationally known expert in digital health, but not only that, also advancing methods in the design, creation, optimization, evaluation, and reuse of digital health technologies, and also advancing methods and theoretical thinking about behavior change. He really is an intellectual and activity dynamo. In his role in the School of Public Health and as Associate Dean for Community Partnerships, he facilitates equitable participation, contribution, and benefit. I have known Eric for many years, and he's always brimming with excellent ideas and has very, very good social values that I appreciate enormously. And I'm sure we're in for a treat of a talk, which is entitled Beyond Behavior Change, Rethinking Our Scientific Approach to Building Back Better for Health and Sustainability. Dr. Hekler, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Susan. It is truly an honor and a privilege and a pleasure to be here. And as the title of my talk suggests, I'm intentionally trying to be provocative in here to sort of ask big questions, but I also want to start from a frame of my intention here, which is I'm offering this with an intention of compassion and gratitude and out of a desire to help us grow together such that we can have more impact together. And so I just want to make sure you keep that intention in my mind. I actually think a lot of amazing work is happening. This is just a question of what might be the foundational assumptions we're using to help us to do our work more effectively. So with that, and before I jump into this, I want a few key acknowledgements, particularly my colleague, MC Schrafel, who has a big impact on my thinking, particularly this notion of tuning, which I'll come back to. And then my many other colleagues, Patrick Kloshny, Daniel Rivera, and many others here, and my funders, who have influenced my thinking. So I'm going to start with sort of my take-home message on this. Like, why am I saying beyond behavior change? It's kind of an audacious thing to start with in a behavior change conference. But in my mind, I'm seeing an urgent need, as I think we all do, to save ourselves and our Earth. And in my mind, one of the ways that we can do this is if we move our thinking in terms of things, which I think, unfortunately, behavior change right now has that sort of formalism, to processes, and in particular, tuning. Okay, so that's where I'm going, and hopefully by the end that will actually make sense. I don't expect it to right now. So let's start with the problem. Well, there's basically an urgent need for individual, societal, and planetary adaptation. What do I mean by this? Well, of course, we all like to think a lot about health behaviors, such as physical activity and diet of children and its implications on childhood obesity as one example, or the systemic inequities, such as issues of adverse childhood events, abuse, neglect, and its impact on child development. Right now I'm on child, but of course this can also be with adults. And of course, there's key issues here of racial inequities that are really rampant in these systemic inequities. And then, of course, even more broadly talking about this, the issues that we're surpassing our planetary boundaries. If you don't know this, you often talk about just climate change as one of the things that basically keep our planet in balance. But there are many things, such as biodiversity, or the balance of our ecosystems, or the degree to which we are having the right potassium and nitrogen, basically fertilizers. Right now, we're overwhelming our systems. The general thing about this one is basically if we're in these green zones, our planet can self-regulate. When we're not, we've broken the cycles that build self-regulation. And so you can see we're in a dangerous place actually in a lot of these dimensions that help create stability on our planet. So there's an urgent need for us to do something, and particularly behavior change and behavioral science, I think, has a very important role to play. But the problem is I don't think we're really producing what is needed. And to justify that claim, I like to think about this in terms of a diminishing returns curve, right? Like we're putting lots of input in, but the question is how much output are we actually getting from that? And unfortunately, I don't think we're actually doing as well as I think we could. In particular, I want to highlight two key works. So this is, I'm sure everyone's heard about this, the sort of reproducibility crisis, right? That our predictions don't seem to be reliably reproducible. Or the work of Alex Rothman and Pascal Sheeran, particularly how they organize these 46 meta-analyses around the heterogeneity of our interventions, basically suggesting that it's more of the norm that we can't reliably produce behavior change than the exception, suggesting we might be actually not producing what we need to actually help us to make informed decisions. okay? So why are we not producing what is needed? Well, the hunch that I want to offer, and I just want us to ponder together, it might be right, it might be wrong, is that we focus on things in a behavior change paradigm. What do I mean by this? So first, let's start, I think RCTs is emblematic of a thing orientation. And let's first start by this notion of compassion. I want to honor, when are RCTs, randomized controlled trials, I'm sure we all know that, and its variants, the right method? Well, first, I think, when a context is well controlled and contained, it's a really valuable method. For example, when you're using RCTs to study a pill, there's this whole context where we know exactly how that will be implemented in the real world. And so that's really valuable, right? Because we know if we get this to work, we know that it can be implemented in the real world, right? And so it helps us to do things like support decision makings, like use intervention X over Y in given contexts. Of course, there's also other issues, like we want to make sure it produces benefits over the risks and costs. And that's, I think, not necessarily always as true, but I think important frame. And then coming to behavioral interventions, particularly when we're building an intervention, we want it to be stable enough and can be implemented in real world contexts. If that's the case, it can be very helpful. So I think particularly in the UK with NICE, there are, and your whole healthcare system, right? There's a whole structure for you guys to actually implement complex behavioral interventions in ways that just aren't honestly possible in the US, unfortunately, except perhaps with groups like Kaiser or whatnot. But in that context, RCTs can be highly valuable to help make decisions. Another time when I think it's really valuable is when we don't actually know that much. I mean, what are RCTs, particularly going right back to Fisher? It technically doesn't answer the question, does it work? What it actually answers is it rules out alternatives, right? And we're trying to build up our knowledge base. And so it helps us to sort of understand, places where we might want to look. Okay, but what's the unintended consequences? And this is just one, of course, many RCTs that we can imagine that I described. And I'm a big fan of Bess Marcus. She's a mentor. She's a friend. So this is not, again, keep hearing this. I am not trying to critique us. I think what we've always done is valuable and important. And I'm trying to see what might be the future that we can tune to that actually will help us to work more effectively. So, this is an RCT testing a physical activity intervention. And, this intervention clearly worked better than this control, right? But in my mind, when we think this way, it pulls us into a thing orientation. And in particular, I want to highlight two things. Thing one is the interventions, and thing two is the outcomes. This sort of snapshot notion to those things. And so the question, though, is are behaviors really things, right? And is health really a thing that we're striving for, right? So is health, person, or planetary a thing or a process, right? When we have a thing orientation, I would say that it drives us into a kind of framing more around a disease orientation, disease or no disease, or you can imagine a positive frame to this as well, right? Or am I healthy or am I not healthy? That sort of dichotomy. Whereas when I think about health, particularly honoring the WHO definition of health, I think allostasis is a more appropriate conceptualization, right? A states of physical, mental, social well-being in context and across time. And so change is the constant that we actually want to be understanding, and that's what we want to be working from. That's more of a process orientation in my mind. And then by extension, I think the way I think about behaviors, so this is now work Guillaume Chavant's, former student, now a professor in working in Spain, has done, where this is actual physical activity data of people. And you can see this is time series of each person, right? This is what was actually going on, which we couldn't previously see when we only had those little snapshots, right? And so to me, when I look at this, I don't think that the behavior is a thing. What I see it as is probably behavior is one of the many processes that are involved in a human adapting to their context, right? And so the question is how and why are people going up and down in this? And can we start to get better at predicting and adjusting that adaptation process? So moving towards processes more and more. But again, I want to really emphasize and start from a place of compassion. Why do we focus on things? And why have we historically? Well, first, I want to recognize, of course, that historically, our capacity to measure really at the level of time scale and a time series that we would need to actually study processes was limited. But of course, I hope you can see that is no longer the case. And of course, this is physical activity, but there's a lot, we're getting better and better at this across a variety of the topic areas that we care about. And so we can actually study things in time series, which is very exciting. I think another thing to recognize is coming back to that idea of when you don't know much, it's actually valuable, right? So using epidemiological studies is another form of a thing studying, right? We have these little snapshots, and the historic ACEs study, which really helped us to recognize, oh my gosh, there's a lot of traumatic events taking place. This helped us to know where we should pay attention to, right? of course, then it sets up the follow-up of like, okay, then how and why are these things happening, right? And so this is a model that I derived from the Politics of Trauma book by Stacey Haynes, where it's really this notion of, one way of conceptualizing trauma is that people have a compromised sense of safety, belonging, and or dignity, which triggers them to engage in some automatic survival response, such as flee, freeze, appease, tune out, fight. And then that becomes overgeneralized with this. And then, of course, there's potentially a broader political process where as that happens, they lose their capacity as a political agencies and their economic clout, which creates this more systemic inequities, right? So thing orientation helped us to know where to look. Process orientation can help us to know how and why, okay? But again, starting from the compassion part, it's a really good thing. And I think there will always be a need for helping to make sure we can notice, pay attention to the right places, if you will. There's an even deeper reason, though, which is coming back to Plato and how important this analogy of the cave, I would say, as a really, really based assumption on Western science is, right? So I'm sure many of you have heard this, but if you haven't, right, it's basically this idea that we are these people sitting in a cave and all we ever see is the shadows, the particulars, right? And what really matters, and of course, the only people who can truly see it in Plato's world is a philosopher, right? The real truth is above, and it's the shadows that we're actually seeing. And so what we're going for are these universal truths that we're striving for. And you can see that actually the RCT logic, it's what are you doing? You're looking for this average. You're like trying to clean out all the context and all the other variables so that you can get to the underlying essence, the beautiful truth underneath it, right? And so I think that actually undergirds a lot of our thinking, that we think if we can find the essence, we can find the answer. And this, again, just to push this even further, it seems like we actually might be wired towards essentialism, at least weird folk, Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic folk. What do I mean by this? And so in case you don't know what essentialism is, it's basically this idea that certain categories, we believe certain categories are real rather than human constructions, and that the natural categories possess an underlying causal force, the essence, that are responsible for this. And so you can imagine examples like race is a very important one to think through carefully, right? Where we have this notion of we notice this category based on skin pigmentation, and then we latch onto that some underlying essence, and we think that it might be the causal driver on people having different experiences. Of course, I hope anyone who's really been digging into the issues of race and racism, if you take a race orientation, you think it's the skin pigmentation that's causing the problem. But when you take a racism formulation, you realize that it's much more about the social, structural, and environmental circumstances. It's the conglomeration that's a network of effects that emergently creates what we see. So it's a process formulation, right? And I would really invite you to read this fantastic article by Brooke Hood et al. On illusory essences, holding back theorizing in psychological science. So I think essentialism is a key thing that we want to look very carefully for, particularly because it might be an underlying bias for us when we're thinking. And I want to particularly highlight that from the work of Lisa Feldman Barrett. This is her popular press book, but you can also dig into the fundamental work as well. But basically, we seem to be wired towards thinking in a kind of thing orientation, if you will, right? Building from Plato and then going right into how our brain seems to be wired, at least weird folk, right? The last thing I want to highlight is sort of the power, particularly when you start thinking in long term, the power of the gravitational force, if you will, of power, norms, default options, basically the history. And so this is a black hole sucking up a sun. I'm not going to actually show the visualization, but I just want you to I want this to be the visual, what you can imagine. Like, imagine as someone gets more and more power, privilege, and resources, more things come to them, not because they deserve it, but simply because gravity is on their side. This is called the Matthews effect when it was first studied in science, right? And by extension, now coming to the structure of scientific revolutions, I'm sure many of you have heard Thomas Kuhn's famous book on this. One of the key conclusions from this book was basically, when do paradigm shifts happen? Well, basically when the old guard dies. And why might that be? It maybe is because they have so much gravitational pull that it's hard to be able to build up an alternative way of engaging, right? So they're going to process orientation. And honestly, coming back to a place of love and compassion, I don't want anybody to die. I want us to actually figure out how to help more people now. But I think it's important to understand these processes, particularly if my hunch is we might be benefiting from a paradigm shift in thinking right now. So, and particularly given our circumstances, I think the time is now for that, And so just to kind of push this forward on this sort of, what do I mean by this paradigm shift? And then I'll switch over to what it would be, is I just want to kind of give you one last visual metaphor to think about. I'm sure many of you heard the old classic, the Earth is at the center of the universe versus the sun is, right? The geocentric versus heliocentric, right? As I think about the work that we've been doing, we've had such a strong foundational work on evidence-based thinking and RCTs. And as I look at it, I feel like what we've been doing is we've been trying to get it to work, starting from that foundational assumption. And so we're getting to places where, and again, I say this with a great deal of love and respect, because I think this is exactly the right question to ask in a thing orientation, but just let's come through this. So this is from the Human Behavior Change Project. What works compared with what? How well, with what exposure, with what behaviors, for how long, for whom, in what settings, and why? To me, that feels like we're trying to make something work, like, okay, there's all these crazy loop-de-loops going on, right? The question I have is there another way? Is there another style of asking questions and doing our science that might actually make it easier? And again, this doesn't mean to actually throw away what we've done in the past. I actually hope that if we can get our foundational assumptions right, it actually will make all of our work easier and help us to do better work together. Okay, so that's what I'm going to try to pitch. And I think I have an idea, but of course, I'm just one human with a limited perspective. This is a collective conversation where we're trying to cultivate collective perception. But so I'm hoping that we can get towards a process orientation. That's my hunch. Okay, so what is behind behavior change? I would say it is tuning. Okay, so what is tuning? What do I mean by that? Tuning is volitional and ongoing adaptations of both persons and contexts towards healthy states of life. And I want to just, as a quick aside, note the word persons I'm using explicitly in an indigenous perspective, noting the idea of perceiving all living beings as having personhood, and therefore having an inherent rights towards dignity and respect. Okay, so tuning is volitional and ongoing adaptations of persons and context towards healthy states of all life. Okay, why am I starting there? Well, it's very much honoring evolution and starting from the notion that adaptation is the norm, not the exception, that all living beings are adapting to their context, their niche, their ecosystems, given their current assets and deficits over time. Okay, and so push this in, try to make it a little bit more where you can see it visually. A behavior change, a thing orientation, I think puts us into this sort of frame. And here we're back to our thing one, thing two, our intervention, our outcome. You could imagine adding a thing three here, which might be a mechanism of action, right? But what would this look like if it were more of a process orientation? Well, in essence, the thing would start to go away, and instead you start to be building feedback loops, right? And I hope you can see this is getting us towards more self-regulatory processes, where sensing is really essential, right? Paying attention to things, measurement, of course, foundation of science. But our goal is actually, in my mind, about getting better at predicting and adjusting. And this is basically the key thing. We're trying to simplify that big question and how can we get better at predicting and adjusting in context, to tune in context towards desired future states. And that's a really key part, right? Like, we're not centering on the past because we already know gravity has a strong or history and default options have a strong gravitational force. We want to be able to tune to the future. Okay. So this to me is a rough draft of, and I hope you can see this is very much similar to our diagrams of tailoring, of course. Again, there's good starting points for our work on this. It's just reframing our assumptions on how we talk about it, is what I'm trying to get at, right? So some of the reasons why I think tuning is particularly valuable is not only does it give you this sort of frame on how to basically adapt in context, but it also works in a really interesting fractal sort of way. So you can imagine it's not just one person tuning themselves, but you can imagine dyads or families or groups or communities engaging in a tuning process, or pushing it even further, particularly once you start unpacking these elements of tuning towards, say, working in a community. You can think about this as almost place-based tuning. And of course, the more folks and more things, the more layers that there might be involved in predicting and adjusting. But imagine you are, and like what I'm doing with my population health work, I'm trying to figure out how do I help my community get better at imagining desired future states and then finding and predicting what that might be given current context and circumstances, and then finding ways to adjust to tune into those desired future states. So it basically comes down to community centering around defined values, goals, assets, and challenges, and wisdom towards living reciprocity, creating models to help us have shared understanding and collective perception, using those models to actually forecast future possibilities, and ultimately with that help us to actually reimagine real possibilities in context and therefore guide our possibility of adaptation. And then with this, guide us towards action, prepping ideas, acting out things, checking if they're working. If they don't work, this is iteration, I hope you can see, and just constantly adjusting and having these flowing through. So tuning, I see it as a very much a fractal process where the same basic ideas can work from a neural to a behavioral to a place-based and beyond frame, which I think is really valuable when you start thinking about both individual health behavior to sustainability behavior changes. So, and just to really push this forward, why tuning over behavior change? I think a behavior change artificially simplifies, but it then unintentionally creates complications. And so I love one of the quotes of Albert Einstein. It paraphrases basically, as simple as possible, no simpler. And that no simpler is really critical in my mind. You want to start from, there's a big difference between complexity and complications. Complexity is basically honoring the inherent properties of whatever it is you're trying to study or understand. Complications happen when, in my mind, one of the key reasons they happen is when you artificially simplify something and then it creates the complications. And in my mind, that's what I feel like we're getting with the current behavior change process. We've made some initial assumptions, foundational assumptions that we didn't even realize we're making. And in so doing, it's making our world incredibly complicated. And I think we can actually do better. And so that's why I think behavior, and then of course, I hope you can see from that tuning frame, behaviors are not the only things we're doing, right? Like we are tuning to other things. Our context also matters, right? This is why we're getting into quote unquote multi-level interventions, which I'd say was another thing orientation, but we'll come back to that. That's why we're moving there, because we're realizing that, it's actually about dynamic processes. And then with that also, change frame pulls us, I think, towards getting to a state, right? A thing. Whereas I think it's really the name of the game is ongoing adaptation in context over time. Okay, so if that's basically the frame, I'm going to now in the last 20, 25 minutes of my talk, I'm going to start talking about how might we be able to do this. And I'm giving you very high level concepts here. And I'm going to point you to some talks, particularly to get into the weeds on a lot of these details, just because this is meant to be more of asking a big high level question of what's the right foundation for our science and our work. So the first step is basically shifts in our thinking. So first, starting from this idea of, I think what we want to be striving for is actually helping people first, helping persons first, or units or communities, right? And so from a thing orientation, I think this is undergirding the logic of the sort of essentialist universalist idea, right? We run these RCTs to figure out what works to produce, quote, generalizable knowledge, and then we disseminate that to the clinics and communities, and then it helps individuals. In my mind, the field of implementation science and the big question all highlight how hard this actually is. And why? Because we're not actually taking meaningfully into account context and time. We're not understanding adaptation. So what's the alternative? Well, the alternative in my mind is starting with the frame of helping individuals achieve the success in context there. And only when you actually start doing that meaningfully and reliably can you start actually looking for how might this help somewhere else. So like I can learn like some strategies on what might be working here in San Diego, and I can share those ideas and I can share the concepts, and then we can actually, and maybe some of those ideas and tools might be useful in London, some of them might not be. That's okay. We actually start to meaningfully create hypotheses of transportability. Notice the explicit switch from generalizable to transportable knowledge, building on the work of Judea Pearl, where we're consciously actually studying, does this tool, this process help us to understand something somewhere else? Okay, so this is more of like the pathway of our scientific knowledge, if you will, how we get to transportable knowledge. We start by helping individuals first, and that individual could be a person, a community, a state, a country. I hope you get the idea. So if we're going to do that, I think an important thing is to know this is so baked into our Western philosophy of thinking in things that I think it's important to have some indicators that we can look for on how we might be falling into the trap of treating a process as if it's a thing. And so here's a few ideas to come from. First, look at your language. Are you using nouns, such as levels in the social ecological model, or verbs, like how things interact, right? Are you not accounting for embodied actions through time? Like, do you really have an understanding clearly of how something actually is going to manifest in the real world? And are you paying attention to adaptation to context through time? If those aren't there, you're probably falling into a thing trap. And then another one would be, how simple is your causal model? Are you working from a relatively simple linear causal structure? If you are, this might be valuable. Again, coming back to the idea of when we don't know much, this is basically helping us to notice subtleties. So really valuable. But when we want to start asking how and why, basically studying processes, and more likely than not, this probably is not actually helpful. Why? Because it lacks clear connection with adaptation in context over time. And then last would be the Nyquist principle. It's basically not accounting for sampling rate. So it's like if you want to try to study heart rate variability, well, you've got to be able to measure it at a sampling rate where you can actually detect that, right? If you measure at once a minute, you're going to completely miss the phenomenon, right? So let me show you this with a concrete example of this. And before I actually show you the one I'm talking about, I want to come back to this notion of tuning and recognize that we are all working within context. And so in my mind, this work that I'm about to highlight, I am actually a huge fan of it. I think it is exactly the right style of work and transitional process, given that we exist within a biomedical thing orientation epistemology, way of knowing. Okay, this is basically a way to help us transition towards, I think, a process orientation. And what I'm talking about is actually the science of behavior change within the US. I hope you can see the causal logic and structure here. A lot of the indicators are actually functionally happening here with this. And this is true even with I think the fantastic and awesome work of Alex Rothman, who I am just, he's a mentor, he's a friend, he's someone that I really deeply respect everyone who is doing this work. And I think given context, this is a great strategy because this is something that could actually feasibly get resources to help us move forward. So it's awesome. But it might also be limiting our capacity to really make progress. So I just hope we can build on this, but not necessarily get stuck with this. Because again, I think it's making lots of complications because it doesn't start with a starting assumption on the right level of complexity. Okay, so what does this mean to continue to help us make this shift in thinking? A thing orientation has, I think, a goal of basically testing if an intervention or a mechanism, quote, works on average, basically trying to find an essence, right? A process orientation, I think, is focused on the idea of helping persons tune themselves in context towards health. So, and that's the success here, right? In the thing orientation, we're basically asking the question of, is one thing better than another thing? Whereas in the process orientation, I think what we're asking about is allostasis. Are we cultivating more good states and less bad states over time in context? The assessments, if we're using a snapshot orientation, is more of a way in things orientation versus time series. And I'll come back to this notion of insourced and outsourced within that. With a thing orientation, we're building a thing, an intervention. With a process orientation, our goal is to understand the processes and apply that to real world use, okay? And I just tuned up this idea of insourcing, outsourcing. So these are two styles of tuning that I like, that MC and I are particularly doing. And I'm giving you a very high level view. There's actually a lot more that we've been thinking about with this. But at a high level, you can think about insourcing as basically tuning by and for the individual. And you're doing things like trying to cultivate knowledge, skills, and practices so that they can tune well. So like, for example, you can imagine this in terms of like helping someone learn the knowledge, skills, and practices that they need to be able to sleep well and wake up on their own, right? Basically build up a really nice cyclical circadian rhythm where their sleep is happening naturally because of their own embodied capacities, right? An alternative to this, you can think about this as outsourcing, where basically we're trying to tune for individuals by some external source. And so I think habits is a form of this, and autopilots. And so continuing with this, and I think we do this quite a bit, actually. I think an important question is, when are these the right things to do? And I think we default towards outsourcing because it's kind of more thing oriented, whereas I think we want to be moving towards insourcing. But an example of this on the sleep orientation is basically outsourcing waking up, not to basically an alarm clock, right? You're not in control anymore. Now it's the alarm clock telling you when to wake up. Right? A value for potentially both of these. And I'm going to go back and forth a lot now with this insourcing, outsourcing idea. Okay. So continuing the idea of like our goal is to think differently. That's this focus here, right? I think a key thing is to think very concretely. So like in an embodied sense, like if you're trying to help someone to sleep better, something that's really valuable is, do they actually know what it feels like to sleep well? Like imagine if you haven't actually slept well, your range on what, quote, good sleep is going to be very small, right? So in our work on embodied interaction, one of the things that we're trying to think about is, how do you expand the range such that someone literally knows, oh, that's what good sleep feels like. Whoa. And think about this from a motivational perspective. Like once you feel what better is, don't you imagine that could draw someone into it, right? So there's a lot of value with that. And I think another example of this is oftentimes we think about yoga as if it's a practice for flexibility. Personally, I see this as very much an embodied practice such that I can learn how to feel. I notice when something is going well or not, and I can tune to that. And it's giving me, coming to kind of a Cone-B model, it's giving me the underlying signals I need to actually know what I should be motivated towards and to tune to use the tuning language. But notice this is very concrete. This is literally thinking what's happening in a person's body. Okay. You can also think concretely outsourcing in a way. So like thinking concretely, like if you're going to send a notification, how exactly is that going to help? So this is a little notification to nudge someone to go for a walk, right? How about taking a few minutes to enjoy nature, right? So think concretely. If you send that notification, exactly what needs to happen to get that to be helpful? Right? So someone needs to potentially read the prompt. They probably need to feel capable of doing it now. They probably would actually appreciate the prompt, right? They then might decide to act or not in a given moment, right? And then they might actually go for a walk. And then over time, right, if they're doing it or not, that might change their feelings of capability or appreciation. And of course, coming back to this is tuning, context is key, right? Context really matters, right? And so there's also the importance of taking into account, like, do you have an opportunity to go for a walk? How stressed are you? Are there others present or not? All those things are things that you might want to take into account. Notice this is very, very concrete thinking with this, okay? So if our first step is thinking concretely, the next is start thinking in processes. And I would particularly invite you to think in feedback loops. And I don't have time. If you haven't read this book, I would strongly advise you to read it. It's really solid work. And this is basically Lisa Feldman Barrett's framing on basically how our brains work, where we're basically engaging in our experience of reality is actually the predictions of abstract concepts. Behaviors actually happen in the simulations, and this is where our sensation actually comes into play. So, and the whole notion here is that we're basically driven towards body budgeting, basically adapting to our context. So again, here's adaptation. A nice, clean understanding of processes. Okay, of course, there's other processes. An outsourced one is classical and operant conditioning. I'm sure we all know a lot about that, so I'm going to move forward with that one. But a really handy one, right? You can also then start thinking about how processes interact. I talked about this one before, a potential frame on thinking about trauma, right? And how might we be able to work through it, right? Where our goal is basically to help to cultivate a sense of safety, belonging, and dignity, and basically reduce the overgeneralization of automatic survival responses on one hand for individuals, and collectively recognize the power of black holes such that as people start losing political agency, others will get more and more, not because they deserve it, but just because they have gravity on their side, right? So you can see there's sort of three dynamic processes that are interacting here to actually help us to understand systemic inequities. And again, I hope this actually honors the complexity without compromising the complexity, and in so doing, helps make things less complicated, okay? And then you can, that's a really cool video, but you should watch it later. And of course, just coming to climate, this is true of our planet too, right? Basically what happens is when these things are in the green zones, it means that we have a nice cycle going on with our carbon cycle or our water cycle or our nutrient cycle, right? When we surpass it, we've broken the cycle. We've broken the place to basically create allostasis. And so understanding those cycles is absolutely essential to understand, to move forward, okay? So if that's thinking our shifts in how we think, I want to then say, what are our shifts in the focus of our work? Well, first, I want to start with sort of what I would frame as a really valuable transitional method, because it's right on this bridge, in my mind, between thinking in terms of things versus processes. And coming back to like the science of behavior change, I think this is another one that's like, this is really great at honoring our current context and circumstances. I think this is a powerful bridge methodology, which is microanimization trials. So the basic idea of a microanimization trial is what you do is you randomize not between persons, but at the decision points when you think something would be helpful. So we're going to send suggestions taking into account these factors. And in this initial trial, it was actually 5 times per day that we microanimized either delivering it or not. And most key to this is we measured the proximal outcome afterwards. 30 minutes after sending this notification, did you go for a walk or not? And we measured that after every single one of them. And so now what we've done is we've actually closed in the randomization to a place where it's now getting closer to actually studying the processes. And so what this allows us to do is it allows us to ask questions of basically like the intervention main effect. In general, this little notification did seem to work, but we can also take into account time varying factors. It worked really well in the beginning of the intervention, and by the end, it seemed to really dissipate. But then we can also ask questions like time varying moderators, basically like in what states or context does this work? And so with this study, we found that if we seem to have sent more than 2 notifications on a given day, that's when we really lost people, particularly at the end. But if we sent less than 2 notifications in a given day, it actually seemed to be helpful still at the end. You see it? We're starting to get to kind of processes, like a proto process, because we're starting to unpack these elements. And again, I would frame this coming back to when we don't know that much. Randomization is randomized trials like this are really valuable. I think this is a really good place to help us to start to see where we need to learn more stuff about process. And for more information, I would really invite you to watch my colleague Pedja Kloshnia's whole webinar on this from the Methods Mind the Gap NIH series. Okay, and just one little quick note, you can also do this not just for digital things. So this is a study design that we're thinking for population health with my colleague Joe Godino at Family Health Centers of San Diego, where what we're actually thinking about is actually microanalyzing if someone receives telehealth coaching on a weekly basis or not, and then monitoring systolic blood pressure on a given week or afterwards. Okay, so that's the sort of, so just to make sure you extend that out. Okay, so that's, now let's move into even more deep, like studying processes. I think, and so I'm particularly giving a shout out to my colleague MC Schrafel and her work on Experiment in the Box, which I've contributed to as well. The goal of this is to help in-source knowledge, skills, and practices for health resilience. And so this is just a very simple example. What we basically do is we take prior knowledge on what seems to be helpful. So we're building on physiology and understanding of behaviors, and we turn it into a simple little experience, an experiment in a box, a little experiment that someone can try to see if it helps them to feel better. And we particularly try to pick things on a time scale where we think if they do it enough, they should be able to feel it. So like sleep is one example we've done. This is another one, like basically up your greens. Eat more greens in your day and see how you feel within 5 to 7 days. And the measurement's very simple. Basically, how do you feel? Do you feel better, worse than yesterday with this intervention? And how doable is it? And with this, all data are good data in this context, right? If you learn that it doesn't help you, great, you just learned something. If you learn that it does help you, great, you just learned something. You're starting to learn how to tune, okay? And so particularly I would invite you to MC's website and this little primer to kind of understand this in more depth. And if I may, just pulling this out to an extension, I'm actually, we're working on this as a new funding from the California Initiative for the Advancement of Precision Medicine, a precision population health approach, where our true north is all about the interactions, the healing relationships between promotoras, navigators, and actually resident leaders to work on this dynamic feedback loops. But particularly coming back to the XP, one of the things we're thinking about is making these short, actionable, self-guided strategies where people can try out strategies for reconnecting with their body, reconnecting with their mind, and reconnecting with their meaning, and particularly building on this great work from the book, The Body Keeps Scores, and the underlying science behind it. But there are very simple, actionable things that can kind of fit in the XP frame for this. And so in my mind, as a field, to move towards a tuning orientation, one thing we could do is just create a lot of experiments in the box, these simple little tuning experiences. And I hope you can hear, this is very much in line with N of 1, self-study, self-experimentation. Yes, that's exactly right. We are doing this already. It's just shifting our perspective on what we're doing such that it reduces complications. So as a field, we could create experiments in the box for a wide range of health and sustainability behaviors, enabling persons to do in-source tuning. So if that's the insourcing, what's the outsourcing? So I think a lot of you have probably heard of me with my work on control systems engineering. Control systems engineering is a field where it's basically focused on supporting dynamic decision-making in complex environments, right? But metaphorically speaking, you would think what a control system is doing is the exact same thing as a health coach, right? A health coach monitors and what's going on with a person, figures out and makes predictions. Here, predict and adjust, right? Makes predictions on what's going to happen and then makes adjustments from that. And then monitors, sees what happens and continues to make these adjustments over time, right? So what happens in a control system is you basically have two key tools. You have a predictive model, a computational model that basically helps you to run simulations and make predictions about this, in which you can study using a methodology called system identification, which is a lot like microanimation, but there's important distinctions that I can't get into right now. And then the other one is tools of adjustment, where basically you're trying to test if my decision-making is having a good response. And I don't have time to actually get into the depths on this, but I would invite you to go into some webinars, particularly my close colleague Daniel Rivera, his talk at the Mind the Gap webinar, or the one that I gave, where I go into great depths on how exactly this works. I also want to highlight this other talk that I gave in partnership with Misha Pavel, Donna Sprout-Metz, and this is very much building on one of my students, Lisa Gotzian's work, where we're really trying to describe concretely how you take all of our prior domain knowledge, again, recognizing there's a lot of good stuff we know. How do you take that prior domain knowledge and turn it into computational process models to guide thinking and decision making? And then how do you actually use that to create a system identification experiment where you're actually studying your predictive model, not studying the intervention? You're getting to a process studying. So I invite you to look there for more details on that. And then just zooming this out again, as I hope you can see, I keep focusing from individual and zoom out. I would point you to the work of Aaron Hennessy, Ross Hammond, and others. This is a causal loop diagram that they actually built with a community to help guide decision-making on how they actually create a more robust population health approach. And you can go to this to hear the talk and then dig into her work and papers on this. And last thing on a side, connecting this to climate science, I want you to remember that predictive models are quite literally what is guiding our planet's decision-making right now in climate change, right? So mathematical equations are easier for climate scientists to understand than our words formulations, right? And I have colleagues, engineers and others who are actually using like the computational models that Daniel and I and others have made and are incorporating those in to help better understand human behavior, right? So these predictive models, so just to kind of move forward with this, as a field, we could also, in a more tuning orientation, we could really be focusing on creating predictive models and adaptation algorithms, particularly when outsourcing aligns with the person's needs and desires, and as a pathway, I hope, towards actually more insourcing. Okay, so that's a focus on how our work would do differently. The last thing I'm going to highlight is even broader, which is basically a shifts in our worldviews. And so what do I mean by this? Well, particularly, here living in the US and with the COVID pandemic and just recognizing the racial reckoning and starting to really understand and think about the histories of Western culture, colonization, the impact on indigenous peoples. Sadly, the more I think about it, I think that there's been a lot of layers in which we have built our ways of making quote unquote progress using oppression. And I think what we're really striving for, and I think as a new vision on how we could be, which is also a very old vision on how we could be, is to increase reciprocity. So what do I mean by this? And anyone that's gotten into climate science work, as I imagine, has seen this little diagram, right? Where humans see themselves at the top of the order of life, right? And so our goal is basically to accumulate resources. I hope you can see the thing orientation here, right? So we engage in pecking order as authority decides, competition, and essentialism is very much an undergirding assumption that drives this, right? What could be an alternative way of being? Well, I would say it's, and I wouldn't just say this myself, I'm building on the work of Professor Robin Wall-Kimmerer, which I'll come back to in a moment, but really this notion of reciprocity, cultivating life, across work. And so, as I said, giving this as a metaphor, and I would really strongly invite everyone to read this book. I think it is one of the most beautiful and inspiring works I've ever read. From Professor Robin Wall-Kimmerer, who is both a distinguished professor and a member of the Potawatomi tribe. She gives all of this indigenous wisdom and insights on what an alternative way of being, cultivating the eighth flame, as she describes it. And I want to offer it by offering the wisdom of what plants can teach us with this one of the many examples she gives in her book, the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash. And so why am I bringing these up? Well, there's something really beautiful about corn, beans, and squash. You can plant them separately and they will grow. But if you plant them together, they will grow in living reciprocity. They'll be stronger. How? Corn grows really tall, right? Great. Beans is a vine. They need to wrap around something. They wrap around the corn. But what do beans do for corn? Beans have a unique capacity to actually get nitrogen from the soil, which is a really important fertilizing nutrient for the corn and for the squash. And so it benefits those two. What does the squash do for everybody? The squash helps to keep the ground cover down. So it actually helps keep moisture in the soil, and it also helps to reduce weeds. But it also needs a little bit of shade, which is the benefit it gets from the corn. So basically, when you plant these three things together, these three plants together, you actually have a beautiful example of living reciprocity, which I think is the vision of where I think we could be going, where our processes lived towards living reciprocity. And of course, this is one example. You can imagine ecosystems. There's something really beautiful about one organism's poop is another organism's food. That's cyclical work where the resources are flowing. We're understanding the processes of resources flowing and how that actually cultivates life. Okay, so what does this mean? And just to kind of wrap it up in my last 3 minutes, 2.5 minutes, is first, let's understand the states that we might want to have less of and the states that we want to have more of. And so I think the states that we want to each have moments less of is confident ignorance, also called the Dunning-Kruger effect, emotional blindness, when we just don't recognize that someone might have a different lived experience from us, entitlement, where we think that we deserve something, and then from that, engaging in destructive actions. And I want to highlight, going to this opening pathways, this is something that I have definitely been working on trying to pull out of myself and recognizing that I've had this built into me as a normative process. And so this is not, again, a moral decision-making process. I think moralizing this is not a healthy way to go. I think identifying and always inviting people to be stronger and better is a more healthy way to go. And so what does that mean? I think what we're striving for as a different state is compassion, curiosity, humility, and creativity. And for me, questions I ask myself all the time are basically, what else might be true? How do we know something that we think we know? What harmful normal lives in me? And then what is the next right thing to do? Now, of course, since I had this whole thing about processes, I have to offer a process as a possibility for this, right? So one way that I think we could think about that might reinforce oppression would be a feedback loop like this, where you have some sort of individual perception. You then engage in critical thinking of something someone else has done, particularly often to try to, in essence, tear them apart, creating a pathway potentially towards othering, where you see yourselves as not having a shared understanding, but there's basically, you're building up a pecking order, right? Or if you get past that, you listen to someone and then you market your solution based on the holes in their argument that you're getting, again, creating more control and othering, or even just getting more decision-making such that you start getting gravity on your side, on the resources, right? I hope you can see this is, I think, often the key words we're talking about in Enlightenment era discourse and processes, right? And we have it under this notion of objectivity. So what might be an alternative? An alternative is our goal is collective perception, which is also, by the way, the goal of science, right? Our goal is consilience and shared understanding, and we work through consensus development. Well, how do we do that? I think actually we do this through a mixture of compassion, where we start from understanding where someone's coming from and recognize if there's this big perception. If you look at the video for a moment, here's the perception of reality. We each have a little circle, right? Our goal through compassion is to actually be able to empathize and understand each other such that we can get to a shared understanding together and build that sort of generosity of a benefit of the doubt. With that, we can start to then cultivate gratitude for the ways in which someone might be able to see something that I can't see. And in so doing, move us towards reciprocity, guided by something a la the Three Sisters as a way of being. So in summary, just ending the talk, there's a great need for behavioral health, but we're not producing what is needed. Why? I think it's because we use a thing, behavior change orientation, over a process orientation tuning. We've overcomplicated what we're trying to study. Tuning, I think, might be an alternative way. Tuning is a volitional and ongoing adaptation of persons and contexts towards healthy states of all life. How do we transition to tuning? Shifts in our thinking, focus of work, and our worldviews. And then with that, I think to save ourselves and our earth, let's move from thinking in terms of things, behavior change, to processes, tuning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. That was a real tour de force and quite a roller coaster, very inspirational. And we won't have time to do justice to the many, many questions that are being put in the chat as you've been speaking, but hopefully we'll have time for a couple of them. I'd also like to say that actually what you said today really builds very nicely on some of the presentations we've had during this conference. So we've had presentations about complexity science, systems thinking, very nice presentation of causal loop modeling today in relation to environmental factors, and work that I'm delighted to be part of. And also the behavior change intervention ontology actually has the top level distinction in the basic formal ontology between what are called continuants, which are basically things, and occurrence, which are basically processes. So I mean, we could spend hours and hours discussing these issues, and if only we could all be at a reception for the next hour or two, it'd be wonderful. But anyway, let's crack on with what we have. And I'd like to start off with actually the last question, which I think speaks to quite a few of the earlier questions. So fire away, Eric, and the more concise you are, the more questions we'll get. But we will send you all the questions at the end of this topic, this discussion.
Yeah, and this is a great question, right? So I think it's sort of it's really just sort of setting up what our prioritization is. I think again, coming back to it, there is a lot that we can learn from RCTs and our methods. I'm not saying throw things away. It's just it's just making sure we know what we're actually meaningfully contributing and how we build an accumulating knowledge base. So I think with the microanimation trial, it's a perfect example of there's a thing orientation there. There is an outcome and there's an intervention, and we're studying it in context. And so in my mind, that's basically the short summary statement is basically, let's not throw away our things. Let's just basically make sure we're studying them meaningfully within context, in the service of actually getting us to understand and study the processes so that we get better at predicting and adjusting.
Thank you. Okay, great. Next question.
A useful aspect of things is that they help us to be precise about what we are talking about. In systems thinking, can't we combine thinking about things, elements of the system, and processes, relationships between? Yes, totally. And I think this is very much the ontology point coming into play, right? I didn't get a chance to say this, but I'm a huge fan of the ontology work. And why? Because all of this requires really careful communication. And in my mind, that's what you're getting at. You're basically saying, like, when words are imprecise in their capacity to convey meaning, they are definitionally meant to be not representative. They're not actually the thing we're talking about, right? And so I think all of the work that's actually helping us to get to actually say, this is what I'm talking about, whether it be it's a thing or a resource or whether it be a process, when we actually are talking about the same thing, functionally communicating, we'll do better. And that to me is what the ontology work is helping us to move forward. So totally, I think that's exactly right. Again, it's more about what are we prioritizing? To me, I'm trying to understand systems. And if I may, just since you use the word systems, I want to redefine that very clearly. When I think about systems, I think about the processes that are happening within some sort of contained boundary. And that boundary is not a category like a rock versus a tree. That boundary is defining the permeability, right? Think about it in terms of a cell membrane, right? It allows some things to flow in and flow out, but it keeps a lot of other things from flowing in and out, right? So it's a permeability question, right? And so that to me is a much better way of thinking about what we're doing is the dynamic interactions of systems. But again, ontologies, language, absolutely critical. Making sure that we're actually talking about the same stuff is really important.
Great. And if I can, while we get the next question up, it also harks back to dialectical materialism, which is a very interesting philosophical approach that I got to grips with as an undergraduate when I was studying psychology. But that's for another big discussion. So, Mary Menna, do we have the next question that we could put up? Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, very much control theory, in my mind, this is something that I think we've known for a long time that we would need to be moving towards, like studying the processes. I think the issue is we haven't had the tools and resources and capacities to do it. But just as Susan was highlighting, coming back to, I think this is complementary. I totally agree. It was just asking it's just asking us to reframe a little bit of our questioning and then how we're doing our actions, right? Like this, we've known that processes are important. Now I think we're getting to a place where we can actually meaningfully do that well, right? And I think, again, my fear is that oftentimes we're putting so much of our time to basically figure out, does this thing work, that we're not actually getting to the place of how and why do processes manifest to help us, again, I hope you keep hearing it, better predict and adjust. And in my mind, that helps us to simplify a lot. Predicting and adjusting in context is what we're moving towards, which is very much control theory, Carver and Shire, as per what you're getting at.
Great. Next one.
I'd be interested in takes on interventions such as the Alan Carr approach to smoking cessation, which are more like fire and forget interventions, which use a one-off, fairly intensive intervention to create a seismic shift in mindset that is then self-sustaining. So, Robert, I don't know that particular intervention, so my apologies for that, but building on the details you added into the question, which I appreciate, in my mind, that's a lot like the sort of XP approach, but it's more extreme, right? Like, to me, the notion, when I think about it in terms of tuning, the first thing I try to think about is like, how do I make sure that the signals are there such that people can feel it, right? Like when someone is blind to the experience, right? Coming back to the sleep as that analogy, right? Like if you've never felt a good night's sleep, you don't necessarily have the sort of motivational signal pulling you toward better sleep, right? You might have some of it, but not really like that. Oh my God, that feels so much better, right? And so I think coming to the example, Robert, you were getting at is like when someone can literally feel, oh, that's what it feels better. And if you need to do like this really intensive thing so that they can feel that, great. But notice what you're doing is you're actually trying to build that embodied experience of, okay, that's what it feels like. And of course, that's not everything, right? We are tuned to so much more, right? That like as soon as someone leaves the intensive care unit or things like that, they get tuned right back into their and adapting to their context, right? So feeling is not everything, but it's a really important part of the process. And so, yeah, just a brief response to that.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more. And there was an interesting one, just to broaden it out a bit, on the environment that I think came from Neve, Mary Menner. I don't know if you have it there. And then sadly, that'll be our last one, but we have managed to get through quite a few of them.
You did cue me to be efficient, so I'm glad you did.
You're doing a great job. And just while we're waiting for the question to come up, Eric, following this, we have a social event, which is a really wonderful way of doing it, whereby you just go into the social event and then you randomly get 3 minutes with someone. And it's amazing how much you can talk to somebody in 3 minutes. And then the clock goes down and then you come in again and then you meet somebody else for 3 minutes. So yesterday, I think I met 7 or 8 people for 3 minutes each. It was a lot of fun. Cool. So Mary Menner, did you get the question? Let me see if I can find it. It was quite early on. Yeah, here we go. Don't know who that was from. Suggests that imagining new desired states could move the adaptive process towards an outcome that is, for example, socially desired. But what of the spread of human values, which suggests that some folk will not consider, e.g., reduced carbon as a desirable outcome? So I think this is a very good question to end on, because it's absolutely central to our futures. So, Eric.
Yeah, totally. I mean, in my mind, the way I tend to think about it is sort of, when you take it from a tuning perspective, the follow-up question is basically, what are people adapting to? What are they engaging in, right? So when people are denying carbon, what is it that they are not seeing, or what is it that we are seeing? And how do we, through care, compassion, and gratitude, actually start to understand that perspective such that invites us to tune towards them and them to tune towards us? And so this is why, like, honestly, if I had to boil down, like, if there's like one really take home message in my mind, it's that reciprocity feedback loop. Having us all learn how to do that really thoughtfully and well so that we don't other each other and oppress each other, but actually look at each other with love, care, and respect. I think that would go a really long way. In my mind, this gets down to scientific misinformation and whatnot. It comes down to a place where people experience epistemic exclusion, where they basically say, my worldview and way of knowing is just not even honored. And so I'm just going to reject you whole hog, right? That's not a very functional way. Now, does this mean that that this is not, by the way, if I may, just as a note, this is not a moral relativism conversation though, right? This is coming back to foundations of good scientific, trustworthy scientific knowledge, particularly the work of Boaz Miller, I would invite you to look up, who's a philosopher of science. 3 key things. One is basically diversity of thought and perspective, which is, I think, often what we focus about. You can frame this as the marketplace of ideas. But if you only have the marketplace of ideas, you basically have chaos. So but you want to honor it. It's one part of it. A second key diversity is diversity of methods, where what you basically want is you want to have different methods asking about the question. And what they do is if they start pointing in a common direction, you have consilience. And so you basically need observations. They're absolutely foundational for science, right? And then the third is you need a strategy towards cultivating consensus, where basically it's honoring those diversities and coming to sort of a shared understanding, right? And so when it comes to the climate science work and trying to understand those who might be, COVID hesitant or those who are climate deniers, right? Like right now, my hunch is basically they feel such strong epistemic exclusion from our conversations that they just reject whole hog what we're talking about, and they just want to, quote, own the libs or some variation like that, right? Notice own the libs. It's a very oppressive thought. Why? Because maybe they're feeling oppressed. What if the alternative is to honor that perspective, but then invite them to say, okay, what's your way of knowing? What's your epistemology? Let's get to a shared understanding on, okay, if we did this, we can study this more effectively together and actually get to, this is the evidence that would help us to say, to rule out one belief or another belief. And I think ultimately, we really have actually done that, but we've so excluded peoples and ways of knowing that they're not even invited into the conversation anymore. And so we just then get into othering and destroying each other. And that's just not helpful. So,
Eric, thank you very much. What's been so wonderful about this talk has been philosophy meeting science, meeting values. And we don't talk or hear enough about values. So very, very good contribution. And thanks so much for joining us. So you and I can stay here for a few more minutes, and everybody else will go straight away to the socializing event. And I will catch up with everybody in a few minutes. So Eric, thank you again.
Thank you all. Thank you, Susan.